The day Adelaide Abbott stepped off the westbound train at Caldwell, Kansas, she burned the last letter her mother had sent her and watched the ashes scatter into the dry September wind of 1883, and she told herself that the woman who had boarded that train in Boston was already dead. She had planned it that way. She had sold every piece of jewelry her late father had given her, tucked the modest sum into the lining of her traveling coat, and purchased a one-way ticket to the furthest frontier town she could find on a rail map without needing to change trains more than twice. She had told no one where she was going. Not her grieving mother, not her two older brothers who had sold her engagement without her consent to a banker named Cornelius Vance, and certainly not Cornelius Vance himself, who at 47 years old had already buried one wife, and had the audacity to smile at Adelaide across her father's funeral casket, as though she were an inheritance he had already collected. Adelaide was 24 years old, and she had come west to disappear, and she had every intention of doing exactly that. Caldwell in the fall of 1883 was not a quiet town. It sat hard on the Kansas-Indian Territory border, and it had earned itself a reputation as one of the last wide-open cattle towns on the Kishom Trail. The cattle drives were winding down. The railroad had already shifted most of its commerce north, but Caldwell still breathed with the particular energy of a place that had not yet decided whether it would grow into something respectable or burn itself to the ground trying. There were wooden storefronts painted in fading optimism, a main street that turned into a river of mud when it rained, 3 saloons that Adelaide counted before she had even reached the far end of the platform, and a church with a cracked bell that someone rang every Sunday morning regardless. She found a room above a dry goods store owned by a widow named Mrs. Clara Hennessy, who was sharp-eyed and practical, and who charged Adelaide $4 a month in advance without asking a single question about where she had come from, which Adelaide took as the finest quality a landlady could possibly possess. The room was small. The window faced west, which meant she watched sunsets every evening that looked like the sky was on fire, great sweeping oranges and reds that had no equivalent in Boston, where the buildings blocked most of the horizon, and the sky was something you caught in narrow slices between church spires and telegraph wires. Here the sky was enormous. It pressed down on the town with an intimacy that should have been suffocating but was instead, somehow, freeing. Adelaide would stand at that window every evening with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, and she would breathe slowly, like someone practicing the act of surviving. She found work almost immediately. The town's only physician, a well-meaning but overwhelmed man named Dr. Harlan Webb, needed someone who could read and write to keep his patient records and assist with the occasional minor procedure. Adelaide had a good hand and a steady nerve, both of which she had developed in the years of running her father's household accounts while he was ill and doctor. Webb hired her after a 10-minute conversation that consisted largely of him asking her if she fainted at the sight of blood and her assuring him, with complete honesty, that she did not. The work suited her. It kept her hands busy and her mind occupied, which were the 2 most dangerous things to leave idle in a woman who was trying very hard not to think about anything. She had been in Caldwell for 3 weeks before she met Albert Ashford, and the meeting was so unremarkable in its circumstances that she would later find it almost comical that it had changed everything. He came in on a Tuesday afternoon with a gash along his right forearm that he had wrapped with a bandana already soaked through with blood, and he held his hat in his left hand with the particular patience of a man who had been waiting in pain before, and had learned there was no virtue in announcing it too loudly. He was tall, somewhere in the range of 30 years old, with dark hair that had been cut practically rather than fashionably, and the kind of sun-weathered face that came from years spent mostly outdoors. He had gray eyes, the color of early morning sky before the sun decided what it intended to do with the day, and they were observant without being aggressive, which Adelaide had learned was not as common a combination in men as it ought to be. "Dr. Webb is out on a call," Adelaide said, rising from behind the desk. "I can clean and dress that if you will sit still for it." He looked at her for a moment. Not in the way that men sometimes looked at her in Caldwell, with the particular calculation that assessed whether she was available or affiliated, but in the way a person looks when they are trying to determine whether someone is competent. It was a look she respected. "All right," he said, and sat down. She worked efficiently, cleaning the wound with carbolic solution, which she warned him would sting before she applied it, then stitching the deeper portion of the cut with the small, neat stitches that Dr. Webb had taught her to make. The man sat absolutely still throughout the whole procedure and made no complaint, which she appreciated. She had stitched up 2 cowboys in the past 3 weeks who had expressed the opinion that they were dying at considerable volume. "What happened?" she asked, not particularly because she needed to know, but because silence during stitching sometimes made people more anxious rather than less. "Wire fence," he said. "New section out on the east pasture. I was not paying sufficient attention." "Wire fencing is spreading fast," she said. "Too fast for some people's liking," he said, and there was something neutral and careful in how he said it, the tone of someone who had opinions on a subject but had learned that not every room was the right place to express them. She finished the stitching, wrapped the arm in clean linen, and told him to come back in 5 days to have the stitches checked. He paid the fee, which was 50 cents, without any negotiation, and stood to leave. He paused at the door. "I do not believe I have seen you here before," he said. "I am Albert Ashford. I run the Ashford Ranch about 6 miles northeast of town." "Adelaide Abbott," she said. "I assist Dr. Webb." He nodded, as though this were entirely sufficient information and he required nothing further. "Thank you, Miss Abbott. You have a steady hand." Then he was gone, and Adelaide sat back down at her desk and picked up the pen she had set aside and thought, for exactly 3 seconds, about the way his gray eyes had looked at her with that calm, assessing patience, before she firmly directed her attention back to the patient records she was supposed to be updating. She had come west to disappear, she reminded herself, not to notice the color of some rancher's eyes. He came back in 5 days, as instructed. The stitches were healing cleanly, and she told him so. He thanked her. He put his hat back on and left. He came back 2 weeks after that, not for the stitches, which had long since healed, but because one of his ranch hands had taken a fall from a horse and fractured 2 fingers, and he had driven the man into town himself in a buckboard wagon. Dr. Webb was present this time, and he handled the fingers while Albert waited in the outer room, turning his hat in his hands with the unhurried patience that seemed to be simply his natural state. Adelaide was organizing the medicine cabinet, which needed reorganizing because Dr. Webb had a philosophical approach to filing that Adelaide found challenging to work with. "How is the arm?" she asked. "Good as new," he said. "You do fine work. Dr. Webb taught me." "He taught you the mechanics," Albert said, "but the steadiness is yours." She glanced at him. He was not looking at her when he said it, but was looking down at the hat in his hands with an expression that suggested he had simply stated a fact and was not attempting anything further with it. She found this, against her better judgment, charming. "I was a rancher's daughter," she offered, and immediately wondered why she had said it at all. She had been very careful for 3 weeks not to offer anything about her past to anyone. He looked up at that. "My father died earlier this year," she said. "I am sorry," he said, and he meant it. She could hear that he meant it with the particular accuracy of someone who had lost people of their own. She nodded and went back to reorganizing the medicine cabinet, and they did not speak again until his ranch hand came out with his fingers splinted. And then Albert guided the man carefully out the door with a hand at his shoulder that was both supportive and matter-of-fact, the way a person touches someone whose pain they are taking seriously, but do not intend to make worse with excessive fuss. The door closed behind them, and Dr. Webb came to stand beside Adelaide at the medicine cabinet. "That is Albert Ashford," Dr. Webb said, though she had already told him she had met the man. Good man. Came out here about 8 years ago from Virginia, built that ranch himself from nothing. Lost his wife 3 years ago, fever. Adelaide said nothing. His younger sister lives with him, Dr. Webb continued, which she had not asked for. Takes care of the household, fine family. Dr. Webb, Adelaide said pleasantly, are you telling me all of this for a particular reason? Dr. Webb cleared his throat. Only making conversation, he said, and went back to his office, and Adelaide allowed herself privately the faint edge of a smile. The town had rhythms that Adelaide learned over the following weeks with the same methodical attention she had brought to everything useful in her life. She knew which days the general store received its supply shipment, which mornings were quietest at the well, which families attended the Sunday service, and which preferred to stay home. She knew the names of the other women in town who worked in various capacities, some running boarding houses, some working in the restaurants. One woman named Mrs. Dollars-Rays who ran the laundry and whose husband worked as an interpreter between the ranchers and the Comanche traders who still occasionally came through. Adelaide found herself drawn to Mrs. Rays, who was direct and practical and laughed easily, and they developed a habit of sharing coffee on Tuesday mornings when Mrs. Rays's laundry work was lightest. It was through Mrs. Rays that Adelaide learned more about the surrounding country and its complications, including the ongoing tensions between the larger ranchers who were stringing wire fencing and the smaller operators, and the remaining free-range riders who had been using the open land for a generation. It was, Mrs. Rays explained without any particular sentimentality, the old argument about whether land was a thing to be owned or a thing to be shared, and it was being settled, as most such arguments in that part of Kansas were being settled, in favor of whoever had the most money and the most wire. And Mr. Ashford? Adelaide asked, which surprised her as soon as she heard herself say it. Mrs. Rays looked at her with the kind of expression that said she had noticed the question but was kind enough not to comment on it. Albert Ashford is a fair man, she said. He fences his own property and does not try to claim what is not his. That puts him in the middle of things, which is where nobody is particularly comfortable. Adelaide absorbed this. She was not thinking about Albert Ashford, she told herself. She was building a picture of the community she had inserted herself into, which was a practical and sensible thing to do. She saw him again in mid-October at the post office. She was collecting the small amount of correspondence she received, mostly medical supply catalogs that Dr. Webb had ordered. He was collecting his own mail, and they exchanged polite nods, and then he held the door open for her when they were both leaving at the same time, and somehow they were walking in the same direction down the main street because both of them were, it turned out, heading back toward the doctor's office, which was near the dry goods store he needed to visit. "You are settling in well," he said. It was not a question, but it was not quite a statement either. It was an observation left open in case she wanted to respond to it. "I am," she said. They walked a few steps. "You are not from here originally," he said. "No," a few more steps. "Neither am I," he said, as though offering this information in trade, fair exchange for whatever she might or might not choose to share. She looked at him sideways. "Virginia, Dr. Webb says." He had the grace to look faintly amused at that. Dr. Webb is a generous man with other people's histories. "He is," she agreed. "He told me several things about you that I did not ask for." Albert glanced at her, and there was something in his expression that was warm and careful at the same time, like a fire built for heat rather than spectacle. "And what did you make of them?" "I made nothing of them," she said. "People are rarely the sum of what other people say about them." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a wise way to approach things." "It is a self-interested way to approach things," she said honestly. "I prefer to be taken as I am, so I try to extend the same courtesy." They reached the point where his direction diverged from hers in front of the dry goods store. He stopped and turned to face her, and she stopped too, because it would have been rude to do otherwise. "Miss Abbott," he said, "would you object to me visiting Dr. Webb's office sometime when nobody needs stitching?" She looked at him. He was absolutely serious, and there was something in that seriousness, the absence of pretense or performance, that she found she could not dismiss. "I would not object," she said, and walked on and did not look back, and was annoyed with herself for the fact that she wanted to. He came the following Thursday afternoon, which was the slowest afternoon in Dr. Webb's week. He brought 2 apples from an orchard he apparently had on the ranch property, simply handing one to Adelaide and keeping one for himself with no particular ceremony about it, as though they were old friends who had always shared fruit on Thursday afternoons. Dr. Webb was napping in his back office, a habit Adelaide had stopped trying to correct, and so they sat on the wooden bench outside the office door in the October sunshine and ate their apples and talked. She learned that he had come to Kansas at the age of 22 with his late wife, Eleanor, and $120, and the specific intention of building something that was entirely his own, because what was left in Virginia after the war and the years that followed was mostly other people's grief layered over other people's ambitions, and he had wanted space enough to find out what was his. He had spent 3 years working for other ranchers before he had enough to buy his own land, had built the house himself with 2 hired men, had started with 30 head of cattle, and had grown to 300. His sister Josephine, who was 28, had come out 2 years after he had, following her own divorce from a man who had proved to be considerably less than advertised, and she had been running the house ever since and seemed, Albert said with evident affection and also evident resignation, to be deeply satisfied with the arrangement. He did not say much about Eleanor except in passing, but what he said was gentle and honest in a way that told Adelaide more than a lengthy speech would have. He had loved her and she was gone, and he had rebuilt himself around the absence of her, the way a tree grows around a wound in its bark. It was not a performance of grief. It was simply a fact about who he was now. He asked her, in return, nothing direct. He asked what she thought of Kansas compared to wherever she had come from, and she said she found it startlingly honest, the landscape, in the way that it showed you exactly what it was without any attempt at decoration. He asked what she enjoyed about the work with Dr. Webb, and she said she found it satisfying to be useful in a way that had measurable results. He asked whether she had found the town welcoming, and she said most of it, with perhaps the exception of a man named Garrett who ran the larger of the 2 competing cattle brokerage operations, and who had a way of looking at her that she did not particularly appreciate. Albert's expression did something careful and controlled at the mention of Garrett. "Roy Garrett," he said, and there was a flatness in his voice that was more informative than any elaboration. "You know him," she said. "Everyone knows him," Albert said. "He is the kind of man who acquires things. He has been trying to acquire the property on my eastern boundary for 2 years. He and I have come to an understanding on the matter." "What kind of understanding?" "The kind where I said no, and he has not yet accepted that the word applies to him." Adelaide found herself unexpectedly pleased by this answer, which was honest and direct without being dramatic. "I see. He will not trouble you if you make it clearly known that you have no interest in his attention," Albert said, and then added, with the careful fairness that she was coming to recognize as a fundamental quality of his character. "But you should know that I say that not because I think you need my assessment of how to handle the situation. You clearly have excellent judgment. I say it because I know Garrett and you do not yet, and information is worth more before you need it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Albert," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it. "That is a very sensible thing to say." He looked at her with those gray morning sky eyes, and something in them warmed by a degree that was entirely visible and entirely unguarded. And Adelaide felt something shift in her chest that she had been very carefully keeping still for the better part of 3 months, and she was both frightened by it, and on some level she had not expected to still possess, grateful for it. She changed the subject. They talked about the coming winter, about whether the cattle market would recover. about a book she was reading that she had borrowed from the general store's small lending shelf. He had read it 2-3 years ago and had an opinion about the ending that she challenged, and the conversation grew warm and lively in the particular way that conversations do when two people discover that the other one has a mind worth arguing with. When he finally stood to leave, the sun had moved considerably along the sky and the afternoon had cooled. "I enjoyed this," he said. "So did I," she said. He picked up his hat, settled it on his head, and looked at her one more moment with that expression that was becoming familiar to her, careful and honest and entirely without performance. "Then I will come back if that is agreeable." "It is agreeable," she said. And that was how it began. November came to Caldwell with a wind that had crossed the entire breadth of the open plains and arrived with all of its gathered cold and force, and Adelaide added a second quilt to her narrow bed and bought a heavier coat from the dry goods store and felt, despite the cold, a strange and growing warmth that she attributed initially to the simple comfort of having settled into a routine, a place, a set of familiar faces, and refused for several more weeks to attribute to anything else. Albert came to town every Thursday, and sometimes on other days if his business brought him in, and they developed an easy habit of talking. Not courting, Adelaide told herself firmly. Simply two people who found each other's company worthwhile, which was a distinction she maintained with increasing effort as November became December and the conversations deepened. She learned his opinions on things that mattered and things that did not. She learned that he had taught himself to read law books after a boundary dispute. His first year on the ranch had left him at the mercy of a lawyer he did not trust, and that he now had a working knowledge of Kansas land law that several of the smaller ranchers had come to rely on informally. She learned that he could not carry a tune in any key but could whistle with great accuracy, and that he found this discrepancy both amusing and mildly frustrating. She learned that he had a quarter horse named Clement who was 17 years old and had been with him since Virginia and who would, Albert said with quiet feeling, be buried on the ranch when his time came, because the horse had earned that much. In exchange, Adelaide gave him pieces of herself slowly and carefully, testing the ground before she placed her weight on it, the way you walked across ice whose thickness you were not certain of. She told him she had grown up in Boston, that her father had been an importer who had done well and then badly, and then died before either tendency had fully resolved itself. She told him she had run his household for 3 years and knew rather more about accounts and inventory than any Boston drawing-room education was supposed to produce. She told him she had come west for reasons she was not yet ready to enumerate, but that had been, she said carefully, a matter of necessary self-preservation. He did not press her for more than she offered. He received everything she told him with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, serious and unhurried and without judgment, and said only, one Thursday in the first week of December when the snow had come, and they were sitting inside Dr. Webb's office by the small stove because the weather had made the bench outside impractical. "Whatever brought you here, Miss Abbott, I am glad it did." She looked into her coffee cup and felt, with the precision of a woman who had been very carefully not letting herself feel things, the full weight of what was happening between them. "Adelaide," she said, "you should call me Adelaide." He was quiet for a moment. "Adelaide," he said, and her name in his voice had a quality she could not entirely account for, low and careful and with a warmth in it that she felt all the way through. She looked up at him. "Albert," she said, and smiled, and he smiled back, and it was the first time she had seen him smile fully, not the contained, careful expressions he mostly allowed himself, but a real smile that reached his eyes and changed the whole architecture of his face. And she thought, with the clarity of someone who had finally stopped arguing with themselves, that she was in serious trouble. The trouble with Roy Garrett presented itself exactly when Albert had indicated it might, which was after Adelaide had made her disinterest sufficiently plain that any reasonable man would have accepted it and left her alone, and Roy Garrett was not a reasonable man. He was a large, prosperous man of 40 years who had made himself indispensable to enough of Caldwell's commerce that he moved through the town with the comfortable assurance of someone who believed the town existed principally for his convenience. He had begun speaking to Adelaide in September with the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no convincingly, and she had been polite but cool, and he had interpreted the coolness as an invitation to try harder, which was the kind of misreading that Adelaide found both tedious and revealing. In early December, he came to Dr. Webb's office on a day when Dr. Webb had gone to a farm berthed 12 miles out and was not expected back until the following morning. There was a patient present, a young woman named Martha Creek who had come in for a persistent cough, and Adelaide attended to her and then watched, with internal attention, as Garrett sat in the waiting room not because he had any medical need, but because he had timed his arrival to coincide with the office being otherwise occupied. When Martha left, Garrett stood and said that he wanted to offer Adelaide a different position, a bookkeeping role at his brokerage that paid considerably more than what she was currently earning, and that he thought they should discuss it over dinner. And he had the manner of a man who did not truly expect the word no, but had learned to deliver the speech in the form of a question as social courtesy. Adelaide looked at him with the expression she had learned over 24 years of dealing with men who confused her practicality for tractability. "Mr. Garrett," she said, "I am satisfied with my current position and do not require another. I am not available for dinner." His face shifted, just slightly, with the particular adjustment that certain kinds of men made when the world did not cooperate with their expectations of it. "You have been here 3 months," he said. "You might find that having a friend with some influence in this town would serve you better than you expect." "I find that I get on well enough on my own merits," she said. "Thank you for the visit." He left, but the parting had an edge to it that she noted and set aside for later examination. She mentioned it to Albert the following Thursday, not because she needed him to resolve it, but because she had committed to honesty in how she spoke to him, and not mentioning it would have felt like an omission of something relevant. He listened without interrupting, and his expression did the controlled, flat thing it did when Garrett came up in conversation. "He will not do anything overt," Albert said carefully. "He is too aware of his own reputation for that, but he will be less pleasant to deal with. I want you to know that if he creates any difficulties for you with the people in town who rely on him commercially, there are others who hold some weight in the opposite direction." "You mean yourself," she said. "Myself and others," he said. "This is not a town where one man runs everything, however much Garrett would prefer that it were." Adelaide looked at him steadily. "I appreciate that," she said, "though I want to be clear that I am not asking you to protect me." "I know you are not," he said immediately. "I am telling you that the support exists and you may use it or not as you choose. Those are different things." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had understood, without her having to explain it at great length, the exact distinction she was drawing. "They are very different things," she agreed, "and I thank you for the distinction." Something passed between them in that moment that was not quite a declaration, but was more than a conversation, a recognition between two careful, guarded people that they had arrived somewhere neither of them had necessarily been planning to go, and that both of them were, cautiously, willing to be there. December settled heavily over Kansas with its bone-cold nights and its clean white snowfalls, and Adelaide watched it from her western window and felt herself, in spite of everything, growing warmer. Albert's sister Josephine came into town on a Saturday morning the week before Christmas with the express and transparent purpose, Adelaide suspected immediately, of looking at her. She was a compact, direct woman with dark eyes and Albert's quality of unhurried attention, and considerably less of his caution about expressing her opinions. She arrived at the doctor's office on the pretext of picking up a tin of headache powder, stayed for 45 minutes, asked Adelaide 17 questions of varying degrees of subtlety, and left apparently satisfied. The following week, She came again and brought Adelaide a jar of apple preserves from the ranch and a clear invitation to Christmas dinner, which was being held at the ranch with what sounded like a considerable gathering of the surrounding families. "My brother suggested I invite you," Josephine said, with the precision of someone who intended for that information to be heard clearly. Adelaide looked at the jar of preserves and felt something she could only describe as shy, which was not a feeling she had had much occasion to experience and found somewhat surprising in herself. "That is very kind of him," she said. "Yes," Josephine said, with a smile that contained several things at once. Adelaide went to Christmas dinner at the Ashford Ranch on the 25th of December, 1883, and it was the first Christmas she had spent with any feeling of warmth in 4 years, since before her father became ill, and the household had turned gray with the long, slow business of loss. There were 8 families present, ranchers and their wives and their children, and Mrs. Reyes and her husband were there too, which Adelaide was genuinely glad of, and the house was large and plainly furnished but warm with firelight, and the particular warmth that comes from people who have decided to make a celebration out of whatever materials they have available. The house told her things about Albert that she had not known before, the books on the shelf, which were numerous and clearly read, the careful way the furniture was arranged around a central hearth that was obviously the organizing principle of the household, a drawing on the wall, pencil on paper, of the view from the east pasture, done with skill and some feeling, which she stood and looked at until Josephine appeared at her shoulder and said with quiet simplicity, "He drew that 2 winters ago, after a particularly hard year. He said he needed to remember what he was doing it all for." Adelaide looked at the drawing for another moment. "He is talented," she said. "He is many things," Josephine said, with the affectionate exasperation of a sister who had been watching her brother not notice his own qualities for 30 years, some of which he is only recently being reminded of. Adelaide looked at her. Josephine met the look with perfect equanimity. "The preserves are better on the biscuits," Josephine said, and went back to the kitchen. Albert found her by the drawing later in the evening, after dinner had been eaten and the younger children were asleep in the spare room, and the adults had settled into the slower, more comfortable rhythms of late celebration. He stood beside her and looked at the drawing with her. "Josephine told you," he said. "She did," Adelaide said. He was quiet for a moment. "I drew it because I was afraid I had forgotten what it looked like when everything was not simply difficulty," he said. "It was a particularly hard winter." "The winter after Elena," she said quietly. He nodded. "The winter after Elena." They stood in silence for a moment that was full rather than empty. "I find," Adelaide said carefully, "that I have been afraid of several things since I came here." He looked at her. "Not the things you might expect," she said. "Not the country or the cold or the solitude. I had arranged my entire existence around the idea that solitude was the safest possible condition. I was afraid of the opposite." His voice was low. "What changed?" She looked at him and decided, with the decision of someone who had been running long enough to be tired of it to tell the truth. "You," she said, "specifically, consistently, against my considerable efforts to the contrary." He looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on him before, something open and entirely unguarded, all the careful patience laid aside. He took her hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw it, and she did not. "Adelaide," he said, "I have been trying very hard not to say anything premature or unwelcome." "I know," she said. "I recognize the technique because I was employing the same one." He looked at her hand in his for a moment and then back at her face. "I would like to court you," he said. In the entirely straightforward way he said all things that mattered, properly, with your full knowledge and consent, and without pretending it is something other than what it is. She felt the thing in her chest that had been shifting and warming for the past 3 months arrive, finally, at something clear and certain and absolutely terrifying and absolutely wonderful. "Yes," she said. "Albert, yes." And across the room Josephine caught Mrs. Reyes's eye, and both of them looked somewhere else with the speed and innocent expressions of people who had been watching nothing at all. January of 1884 was cold and clear and brilliant, and Adelaide had never in her life experienced winter this way. The sky an impossible deep blue above the white plains, the air so sharp and clean that breathing it felt like something you were aware of, and she walked through it with a lightness that had nothing to do with the temperature. Courting Albert Ashford was, she discovered, an experience that reflected the character of the man entirely. He was thoughtful and genuine and paid attention to things she mentioned in passing with a quality of memory that was both touching and faintly unnerving. She mentioned once that she had loved the smell of libraries, and 2 weeks later he arrived with a new novel he had ordered through the general store, and no explanation, except to say he had been in a library-related mood. She mentioned that she found the brass astronomical prints in Dr. Webb's waiting room interesting, and he found one, somewhere, at some considerable effort that she was not supposed to know about but gleaned from the expression of general commerce satisfaction on the storekeeper's face when she went to pick up supplies, and gave it to her framed in simple wood, because he thought she would like to have one in her room. She gave him things in return, not objects but information about herself that she had not given anyone in years, the pieces of her life and her thinking that she had grown accustomed to keeping inside because the social expectation in Boston had been that women of a certain station did not have opinions. They had responses, carefully calibrated and never too pointed. She found in Albert the experience of being listened to with genuine interest, every opinion taken seriously and engaged with directly, never managed or deflected, and she understood that this was not something ordinary. She had grown up in a world that had shown her it was not something ordinary, and she was simultaneously grateful and grieved for that understanding. She told him about Cornelius Vance in February, on a Sunday afternoon when the two of them had gone riding together, which they did on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted. Adelaide on a steady roan mare, named Bess, who the ranch kept for gentle work, and Albert on Clement, the old quarter horse who moved with the dignified steadiness of a horse who had been everywhere and found most of it manageable. They had stopped at the top of a small rise that looked out over the wide flat land, brown and white and gold in the winter light, and Adelaide, looking at the horizon and feeling the specific freedom of a view that went all the way to the edge of the visible world, found that she finally wanted to say it. She told him about the engagement, about her father's death and the arrangement made without her knowledge, about Cornelius Vance's expectation that a young woman whose family was suddenly without male protection and in some financial difficulty had very limited options and would recognize them. About the morning she had woken up at 4 a.m. and looked at the ceiling of her childhood bedroom and understood with complete clarity that she could either stay and be buried alive or she could go and find out whether she was still capable of being herself. Albert listened to all of it, motionless on Clement, looking at the horizon with her. When she finished, he said, "Your brothers agreed to this arrangement." "They negotiated it," she said, "without telling me. My eldest brother, Charles, had borrowed money from Vance and was looking for a way to resolve the debt on favorable terms. I was the favorable terms." There was a silence in which Adelaide could feel Albert applying considerable effort to the management of his response. "You are not on speaking terms with them," he said finally. "I wrote to my mother before I left to tell her I was safe and that she should not worry. I did not tell her where I was going. I have written 3 times since, always posting from a different town through a forwarding arrangement I set up, because I was not certain Charles would not try to find me if he knew where I was, and whatever Vance wanted, I was determined he would not have it." Albert turned to look at her. His expression was everything she had come to know of him, attentive and steady and absolutely in earnest. "Are you still afraid of being found?" She thought about it honestly. "Less than I was," she said. I think I have learned enough about being here, about who I am when nobody is telling me who I am supposed to be, that the thought of being found frightens me less. What I built here feels real. It feels like mine." He held her gaze for a long moment. "It is yours," he said. "All of it. And anyone who wished to take you somewhere against your will would have a significant problem." She smiled at him, not because he was offering protection, which she had already told him she did not require, but because he had understood again precisely what she had needed to hear, which was not a promise to fight for her but a confirmation that she was, in fact, firmly in possession of herself and her life. "Albert," she said. "Adelaide," he said. The cold wind moved through the brown grass around them. "I am in love with you," she said, because she was, and she was tired of not saying it. He looked at her with those gray eyes that had been the first thing about him that undid her careful resolution, and they were wide and warm and entirely unguarded. "I have been in love with you since October," he said. "Possibly since the day you stitched my arm and told me the carbolic would sting before you applied it instead of after." She laughed, really laughed, and it rang out clear across the winter plain, and Clement flicked one ear back as though noting the sound with approval. And Albert was smiling at her with the full, uncontained smile she had been collecting like something rare and valuable. And the sky above them was the blue of something endless, and the land was wide open in every direction. She had come west to disappear, and instead she had been found by a place and a purpose and a man who saw her with a clarity that felt not like exposure but like recognition. She rode Bess a step closer to Clement, and Albert reached across the space between them and took her hand, the same unhurried way he had taken it at Christmas, and they stayed there on that rise above the flat winter world until the cold drove them back to the warmth that was waiting for them. Spring came to Kansas, the way it came to most places where winter had real authority, suddenly and all at once, and with a conviction that made the preceding months feel like a misunderstanding. The grass turned from brown to a green so vivid, it seemed almost improbable, and the sky went from the flat iron of February to a blue so deep and clear that standing under it felt like standing at the bottom of something vast and benevolent. The wildflowers came, yuccas and Indian paintbrush and the small pale blooms that covered the pasture fields like scattered light, and Adelaide walked through them on Sunday afternoons on the way to the ranch, and thought that she understood now, in a way she had not understood in Boston, what the word abundance actually meant. Albert proposed to her in March, in the office of Dr. Webb, which was possibly not the most romantic location that had ever hosted a proposal in the history of human affection, but was, Adelaide thought, entirely characteristic. He had come in on a Thursday afternoon as always, with no particular indication that the visit was to be different from any other, and he had waited until Dr. Webb, who had read the room more accurately than he generally read anything, had found a very important reason to be in the back of the office, and then Albert had sat across from Adelaide at her desk and put a small ring on the surface between them, very simply and without ceremony. The ring was not elaborate. It was gold, plain band with a single small garnet, which was the color of dark red and the color of wine and the color of everything warm, and it had belonged to his grandmother, who had worn it from Virginia to Kentucky to Tennessee over the course of a life built entirely on the principle of going wherever was necessary. It seemed appropriate, he said, for a woman who went west. Adelaide looked at the ring and then at him and felt the whole accumulated weight of the past 6 months, the escape and the fear and the careful construction of a new self and the unexpected arrival of this man into the middle of it. And she picked up the ring and put it on her own finger and said, "Yes, Albert. Of course, yes." He exhaled, and she understood that he had been not quite certain, and the fact that he had been not quite certain, this steady and sensible and genuinely confident man, touched her more than any amount of assured certainty would have. "I was not sure," he said. "You are a very self-sufficient person." "I am," she agreed. "And I am choosing this with full use of that self-sufficiency, which means you can trust it completely. He stood, and she stood, and he took her face in both hands with a gentleness that was somehow more communicative than anything that could have been said, and kissed her, properly and with feeling. And in the back of the office, Dr. Webb dropped something that was probably not an accident and then went very quiet. They were married in May, in the small church with the cracked bell, on a morning when the sky was the clear blue of everything beginning. Mrs. Reyes sat in the front row next to Josephine, both of them wearing their best dresses. The ranch hands came cleaned up and uncomfortable in their Sunday collars. Several of the families from Christmas dinner were there, and Mrs. Creek and her daughter Martha, and the storekeeper who had found the astronomical print, and Dr. Webb in a suit that had been very good 20 years ago and was still making the effort. Adelaide wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself over the winter months, with lace at the cuffs and collar that Mrs. Reyes had helped her find, and she walked down the aisle on her own 2 feet, which was exactly as she had intended it. And Albert at the front of the church looked at her, coming toward him with an expression that she thought she would be perfectly content to spend the rest of her life occasionally seeing. The preacher kept his remarks to a comfortable length, and they exchanged their vows with the simple directness that characterized everything that mattered between them. And when Albert put the ring on her finger, the wedding band plain gold beside the garnet of his grandmother's ring, she felt the last remaining piece of the woman who had come west to disappear set down gently beside the woman she was now, and she was glad of both of them. Josephine cried, briefly, and without any apparent embarrassment. Mrs. Reyes did not cry but looked satisfied in a way that was more expressive than tears. Dr. Webb blew his nose very loudly at the moment of the first kiss, which Adelaide suspected was emotional rather than medical. They stayed at the ranch that night, and for the first time Adelaide lay in the large room with its west-facing window and watched the sunset spread its colors across the sky, and Albert was beside her, and the night was warm and the land was fragrant with spring, and she was home. The summer of 1884 was a working summer in the full sense of the word, because a ranch of 300 cattle did not stop requiring attention, because its owner had recently married, and Adelaide did not stop working for Dr. Webb, who had made it quietly but clearly known that her absence would be genuinely difficult to manage, and she had no intention of leaving a role that gave her satisfaction simply because the social expectation suggested married women should redirect their industry to the domestic sphere. Albert had never suggested it either. He had, when she raised the subject, looked at her with a mild expression that suggested the question was not entirely necessary. "You enjoy the work," he said. "You are good at it, it is useful to the town. I see no argument against any of those things." "Some men would," she said. "I am not some men," he said, with the specific quality of not quite modesty that was one of her favorite things about him, the statement of a fact without pride, simply an accurate description. She continued her work with Dr. Webb, and she rode in from the ranch 3 mornings a week, and she managed the household accounts with the same methodical attention she had brought to everything practical. And she began, with Josephine's full and enthusiastic support, a small kitchen garden at the side of the house that first summer that would expand over the following years into a source of genuine provision. Josephine, it should be said, had received the news of Adelaide's engagement with an expression of such transparent relief and satisfaction that Adelaide had been briefly, rather touched by it. Josephine had made clear, with the forthright warmth that was her particular quality, that she had spent 3 years watching her brother rebuild himself with diligence and integrity and very little joy, and that Adelaide's arrival in his life had restored something she had been afraid was gone permanently. "Laughs now," Josephine said, one afternoon in the kitchen while they were putting up preserves for the winter, which was a project that required both of them and produced rather more preserves than 3 people could reasonably consume, but which they continued to make every August because the process itself was pleasant. "Before, he was fine. He was always fine, Albert, but fine is not the same thing as alive." Adelaide stirred the preserves and thought about that. He was doing what needed doing, she said. Yes, Josephine said, and now he is doing what he wants also. The difference is considerable. Adelaide had noticed it too. The laugh that she had worked to collect like something rare had become easier to produce. The smile that had once been so carefully managed appeared without management now when they were alone together or with Josephine in the evenings. He talked more freely, argued more willingly when he disagreed with something, offered opinions on things that were not strictly necessary without the careful vetting she had initially observed him applying to every expression of preference. He was, she thought, a man who was becoming more wholly himself, and the process was a privilege to witness. She was quite sure, more wholly herself than she had ever been. There was a night in late August when they sat together on the porch after Josephine had gone to bed. The lamp turned low inside the house, and the night huge and star-blazing above the plains, which in midsummer offered a sky so thick with stars that the sky itself appeared to have a texture. And Albert had his arm around her shoulders, and she was leaning into him with the comfortable weight of someone who had gotten over being careful. And they were quiet together in the particular way they could be quiet. Full rather than empty, and she thought that this was what she had not known she was looking for when she burned that last letter on the platform at Caldwell. Not safety exactly, though this was safe. Not simplicity, though it was simpler than anything her previous life had offered. But the feeling of being entirely known and entirely chosen and finding in that simultaneous condition something she recognized as herself. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am glad I took the train west," she said. He pressed his lips to her hair. "So am I," he said, "every day." The trouble with Roy Garrett that Albert had predicted would grow did in fact grow, but it manifested in a way that was more irritating than threatening, which was perhaps Garrett's particular style. He put it about town, with the careful indirection of someone who wanted the information to spread without being directly traceable to him, that Adelaide's background was irregular, that she had come to Caldwell under unclear circumstances, and that a woman who appeared from nowhere with no stated history was not the kind of person on whose word one ought to rely in matters of medicine or business. This was the sort of thing that could, in certain communities and in certain times, do real damage. Adelaide was aware of it and observed its progress with the pragmatic attention she brought to problems. She told Albert about it, and he told her what he knew, which was that Garrett had recently lost a property negotiation to two ranching families who had brought their dispute to Albert for legal guidance, and that the current campaign against Adelaide's character was, in Albert's opinion, Garrett's way of expressing his displeasure with Albert without directly challenging him. "He is using you to get at me," Albert said, with a tightness in his jaw that Adelaide had learned to read as the outer edge of his actual anger, which is a coward's approach. "He does not expect a frontal challenge to work," Adelaide said. "He is correct about that. So he is trying to reduce my credibility, which he thinks will bother you." "Does it bother you?" Albert asked. "It irritates me considerably," she said honestly, "but it does not frighten me. I know who I am. The people whose opinion I value already know it too." She was right that the opinions of the people who mattered were not particularly vulnerable to Garrett's campaign. Mrs. Reyes was loudly dismissive of it. Dr. Webb, who had a reputation for unimpeachable integrity, stated publicly, and with some indignation, that Adelaide Abbott, as was, Adelaide Ashford as now was the finest assistant he had employed in 20 years of practice, and he would appreciate it if people would stop repeating nonsense at him. Josephine, who had considerable social currency among the ranch families, spoke to people with the direct efficiency of someone dismantling an argument by its parts, and since Josephine was both well-liked and not to be trifled with, the effect was significant. The situation resolved itself, as these situations often do, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the slow accumulation of evidence that the target was not behaving as predicted. Adelaide went about her work with complete consistency. She was honest, competent, and plainly content in her life and her marriage, which made the suggested portrait of a woman fleeing something shameful increasingly difficult to maintain. By autumn, most of Caldwell had moved on to other subjects, and Garrett, who had achieved nothing except the moderate improvement of Adelaide standing through the community's reflexive sympathy for someone unfairly targeted, appeared to accept that this particular approach had not served him. Adelaide had one final conversation with him, by chance, in front of the post office on a November morning when she was collecting Dr. Webb's supply catalogs, and he was evidently waiting for someone. They came face to face on the wooden sidewalk, and there was a moment where both of them assessed the situation. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, with the careful pleasantness of a man choosing the strategic path. "Mr. Garrett," she said, with the equal pleasantness of a woman who had won and was not required to make anything of it. They passed each other without further remark, and Adelaide walked back toward Dr. Webb's office with the clean satisfaction of a problem fully and finally concluded. By the winter of 1884, Adelaide had made one decision that she had been approaching gradually for several months, which was to write to her mother, not to her brothers, not to anyone connected to Cornelius Vance, who she had heard through the general network of correspondence that women maintain had in fact married a woman from Philadelphia the previous spring, which Adelaide received as both good news and, in a distant way, a relief. But to her mother, who had had no part in the arrangement and whose grief at Adelaide's departure she was aware of and had been living with alongside her own. She wrote a careful letter that told the truth without offering everything at once. She told her mother she was well and settled. She told her she had work she found meaningful. She told her she had married a good man in May, a rancher in Kansas named Albert Ashford, and that she was happy in a way she had not expected to find herself capable of being. She did not apologize for leaving, because she did not think she owed an apology for it, but she told her mother that she hoped, in time, the two of them might find their way to an understanding. She gave her address. The reply came 3 weeks later, which was fast enough that Adelaide understood her mother had written immediately on receiving the letter. It was not a simple letter to read. Her mother was, Adelaide had always known, a woman who had been formed by a world that had limited her options at every junction, and who had made her accommodations with those limitations in ways that Adelaide could not always condone but had learned, with the distance of geography and the perspective of her own year of rebuilding, to have some compassion for. The letter was confused and grieved and full of relief all at once, the response of someone who had spent a year not knowing whether their daughter was alive. Adelaide read it twice and then went and sat with it by the west window and watched the winter sky and felt the specific complexity of loving someone whose choices you did not always understand. And then she wrote back, a warmer letter than the first, and began the slow work of a reconciliation that was not simple but was real. Albert read the first letter over her shoulder after she had shown it to him, which she did not have to do but wanted to, and his response was simply to put his hands on her shoulders and say that he was glad she had written, and that if her mother ever wanted to visit, the ranch had the room. "That may be some time in the future," Adelaide said. "We have time," he said. She put her hand over his and they looked together at the letter from Boston and the winter sky over Kansas and the distance between them that was not quite as far as it had been. The spring of 1885 arrived with the particular extravagance that Kansas seemed to reserve for the season after the hardest winters. A full-blooded, generous spring that turned the world green from horizon to horizon and made it impossible to be outdoors without feeling that life was a fundamentally worthwhile enterprise. Adelaide was enormously glad of it, because she had spent the late weeks of winter in the specific exhaustion and unease of early pregnancy, which she had confirmed to herself, and then to Albert, and then to Dr. Webb in that order, and the return of warmth and vigor to the landscape felt like a personal encouragement. Albert received the news of the coming child with an expression that Adelaide could not have described entirely accurately, but that she thought contained more feeling than she had seen on his face at any previous moment. Something deep and still and very careful, the expression of a man receiving something he had not dared to want. "Are you all right?" she asked, which was perhaps the wrong question for the moment, but she was a practical woman. He looked at her, and his eyes were bright and his voice, when he found it, was not quite steady. "Yes," he said. "Yes, Adelaide, I am very much all right." Josephine, when told, sat down immediately and then stood up again and then hugged Adelaide with a warmth that was characteristic of her best moments. "A baby," she said, with a conviction that suggested this was entirely the correct development. "Good. This house needs one." Adelaide laughed and said she hoped the house would find one sufficient to start with, and Josephine said one was an excellent place to begin. The summer was full and warm, and Adelaide continued her work with Dr. Webb at a somewhat reduced pace as the pregnancy advanced. And Dr. Webb, who was the most experienced practical authority on the subject within 20 miles, took over his own patient management with minimal complaint, and made it clear that he expected Adelaide to return once she was ready and not before. He also made it clear, in the way that he expressed things he found important, that he had been working on a succession plan for his practice, and that her continued involvement in it was central to that plan, a statement that Adelaide received with genuine gratitude and made a note of for future consideration. Albert was, throughout the summer and into the fall, attentive in a way that walked carefully along the line between devoted and overprotective without crossing it, which she appreciated as an achievement. He did not attempt to prevent her from riding Bess on the milder mornings. He did not hover in a way that implied she was fragile. He did not offer opinions on her choices unless asked. What he did was pay attention, consistently and without demanding acknowledgement for it, making sure that things that would require effort were arranged so they required less, appearing with coffee and without comment when she was tired, sitting beside her in the evenings with his hand resting comfortably, and without drama against the growing curve of her belly, as though this were simply the natural place for it to be. His son was born in November of 1885, in the large bedroom with its west-facing window, with Dr. Webb in attendance and Josephine pacing the hallway outside with every external evidence of calm and every internal evidence, when Adelaide saw her afterward, of having spent 3 hours in considerable private agitation. Albert was present throughout, which was not the universal custom, but was Albert's particular preference and Adelaide's strong preference, and he was beside her through the full hard work of it with his hand in hers and his voice steady and close when she needed it. The baby arrived in the late afternoon, when the November sky outside the window was doing the thing it did in autumn, burning orange and gold and red all the way to the horizon, and his first cry was vigorous and direct, the cry of someone who had arrived with intentions. They named him Thomas Edward Ashford, Thomas for Albert's father, who had been a fair man, and Edward for Adelaide's, who had been a good one. He had dark hair from the first day and eyes that were dark and unfocused in the way of all newborns, but that, over the following weeks, resolved themselves into a gray that was his father's exactly, that quality of morning sky before it had decided on its weather. Albert held his son that first evening with the particular stillness of someone, in the presence of something they find overwhelming, and are managing not to drop. And Adelaide watched him from the bed where she was exhausted and entirely well and deeply satisfied, and felt the whole architecture of her life as it had arranged itself over the past 2 years with a gratitude that was so complete and specific that she could not have put it into words, and did not try. "He looks like you," she told Albert. Albert looked up from the baby with an expression of complete and unguarded joy, unmanaged, unperformed, the pure version. "He has your chin," he said. "He is 2 hours old," she said. "I can already tell," Albert said, and smiled, and the baby made a small, indignant sound as though offering a contribution to the discussion. Josephine came in and took the baby with the practiced confidence of someone who had been waiting 2 hours for the permission to do exactly that. And Albert came to sit beside Adelaide on the edge of the bed, and took her hand in the careful way he had been taking her hand since that Christmas evening, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and watched their son being admired by his devoted aunt in the lamplight of the room. The years that followed had the quality that good years have, which is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something sufficient to meet it with. There were hard winters and dry summers, and the ongoing negotiations of ranch life, which was never fully predictable and required constant adaptation. There were disagreements between Adelaide and Albert, infrequent but real, conducted with the directness that both of them brought to everything that mattered, and resolved with the same directness in the particular combination of stubbornness and good faith that characterized their partnership. There were illnesses and recovered from illnesses. There were losses. Old Clement died in the spring of 1887, peacefully in his pasture in the early morning, and Albert buried him on the rise where he and Adelaide had sat on that February day, and he went out by himself for an hour afterward and came back steady and quiet, and Adelaide did not say anything but poured him coffee and sat beside him, and the sitting beside him was everything necessary. Adelaide's mother visited in the summer of 1886, which was an event that had required a full year's worth of careful correspondence to arrange, and whose outcome was uncertain enough that Adelaide cleaned the house 3 times the week before her mother's arrival, and could not fully account for her own anxiety, except that the past had a gravity that did not always submit to resolution on the schedule you assigned it. Her mother was a woman in her late 50s, who had the bearing of someone trained to the standards of a particular social world, and the expression of someone who had spent a long time being uncertain whether she had done everything correctly. She arrived on the afternoon train, and Adelaide met her at the platform, and they stood for a moment looking at each other across the distance of more than 2 years and everything that had happened in them. And then her mother opened her arms and Adelaide went into them, and they held each other on the dusty platform at Caldwell, Kansas, in the manner of people who had found the argument irrelevant to the love, which had been there all along under everything else. Albert met her that evening at the dinner table with Thomas, who was 8 months old and extremely interested in everything within reach, including his grandmother's traveling bag, and who produced the best possible atmosphere for a difficult reunion by being both very small and very determined, and requiring a degree of management that gave everyone something practical and distracting to do. Adelaide's mother was charmed by Thomas in the immediate and unconditional way that grandchildren tend to produce, and she was careful and genuine with Albert, assessing him with the same clear-eyed attention Adelaide had inherited and apparently arriving at a conclusion that satisfied her, because by the second evening of her visit, she was talking to him about ranch management with an interested curiosity that she had once applied to her husband's business accounts. She stayed 2 weeks. She and Adelaide walked together in the mornings, through the kitchen garden and the pasture fields, and along the track that led toward the low rise where you could see the whole flat world, and they talked about many things, some of them easy and some of them not easy at all. They talked about Adelaide's father and what his illness had done to the family and the financial decisions that had been made in its wake. They talked about Charles and what he had arranged without Adelaide's knowledge, and Adelaide's mother did not defend it, and Adelaide did not require her to, and that absence of defense created more space for understanding than any argument could have. They talked about what Adelaide had found in Kansas, the work and the life and the man, and the sense of being fully and freely herself, and her mother listened with the attention of someone learning to understand a language they had always considered foreign. On the morning her mother was to leave, they stood on the station platform again, reversed from the arrival, and her mother held Adelaide's face in both hands as Albert had done on the night they were first engaged, and said, "You are happy." "I am," Adelaide said. "I am glad," her mother said, and she meant it entirely, and Adelaide could see that she meant it, and it was, finally and completely, enough. The train took her east, and Adelaide stood and watched it until it was gone, and Albert stood beside her with Thomas on his hip, Thomas trying to eat the brim of Albert's hat, and she slipped her hand into Albert's free hand, and he held it, and they walked back through Caldwell in the morning light of a Kansas summer, past the dry goods store and Dr. Webb's office, and the small church with its cracked bell, back to the buckboard waiting at the hitching post. Josephine was at the ranch when they returned, stirring something that smelled excellent, and already knowing, by the expression on Adelaide's face, how the departure had gone. She asked no questions. She poured coffee and put it in front of Adelaide and said, "The preserves from yesterday set beautifully." And the perfectly calibrated domesticity of this observation made Adelaide laugh, and Josephine smiled, and Thomas hit the table with a wooden spoon he had acquired from somewhere, and the morning went on in the specific warmth of a house that was full of people who chose to be in it. By 1887, Adelaide had taken on an expanded role in Dr. Webb's practice that was, in everything but formal title, that of a junior physician. She had been reading the medical texts in Dr. Webb's extensive library for 3 years, attending every procedure she was permitted to observe, asking questions that Dr. Webb answered with increasing respect and decreasing surprise. She had a practical competence with a broader range of conditions than the nursing and administrative work strictly required, and the town knew this and acted on it, which meant that when Dr. Webb was unavailable, people came to Adelaide, and she managed what she could and recognized clearly what she could not. Dr. Webb had begun to speak, with the careful hedging of someone who recognized he was making a decision about his legacy, about what would happen to the practice when he eventually retired or was no longer able to continue. He had no children, no partner, no one else in the town who had the combination of knowledge and temperament for the work. He spoke of it indirectly at first, and then more directly as the months passed, and Adelaide listened with the seriousness it deserved. She and Albert discussed it one evening in late 1887, after Thomas was in bed, by the fire that in winter was the organizing warmth of the house. She laid out the situation honestly, that Dr. Webb's intention was to leave the practice, its equipment, its patient records, and its building to her in the form of either a purchase arrangement on favorable terms or, if she preferred, a direct transfer, with his retirement supported by a pension arrangement that the town council was apparently already discussing, and that would not be her responsibility. Albert listened to everything as he always listened, completely and without hurry. "It is what you want," he said. "It is what I want," she agreed, "if we can make it work." "Tell me what making it work requires," he said, and they spent the next hour mapping it out together, the financial arithmetic of it, the practical arrangement of her time, the question of whether she wanted to do the work alone or hire additional assistants. And at the end of the hour the thing was not solved exactly, but the path through it was visible, which was what she needed. She accepted the practice in 1888. Dr. Webb retired to a small house at the edge of town, where he grew tomatoes and read novels and visited Adelaide's office with the frequency of a man who was not entirely able to fully give something up, which she accommodated gladly because she was fond of him, and because his experience was genuinely useful, and because he was invariably good company. She hired a young woman named Ruth Calloway, recently arrived from Missouri, who was sharp and willing to learn, and who Adelaide saw something of herself in, which was both a responsibility and a pleasure. Adelaide Abbott Ashford, physician to the community of Caldwell, Kansas, was not a title that the formal medical establishment of 1888 would have applied, because the formal medical establishment of that time and place had particular views about who could be a physician, and Adelaide was conducting her practice with the pragmatic independence of the frontier, where the nearest formally credentialed alternative was a substantial distance away, and people needed what they needed. She was clear with her patients about the nature and limits of her training, Dr. Webb had been likewise clear in his endorsement of her competence, and the town had long since made its practical assessment. She delivered babies and set bones and managed fevers and diagnosed the common ailments of people who worked hard with their bodies in a hard and demanding land. And she did it with the steady nerve and competent hands and careful humanity that had always been hers. And she found in it every day the satisfaction of work that was genuinely necessary and genuinely done. Thomas grew through the years with his father's steadiness, and his mother's sharpness and Josephine's particular quality of direct, cheerful engagement with the world. He was interested in everything, especially the horses, and by 5 years old he was following Albert through the barn with the absolute conviction of a person who intends to learn everything about a subject by simply being present for all of it. Albert taught him with the same patient attention he brought to all things, never simplifying past usefulness, always meeting the boy's intelligence at its actual level rather than the level assigned by his age. Adelaide found herself watching them together sometimes, with a feeling she could not have articulated without sounding excessive, but which was simply and completely joy. The particular joy of watching the people you love most be entirely themselves in each other's company. The second child arrived in the autumn of 1889, a daughter this time, born with the same vigorous first cry as her brother, but arriving in the early morning when the sky was beginning to lighten, and Adelaide held her in the new morning light, and thought that this child had come into the world with the dawn, which seemed entirely appropriate for someone who would prove, over the following years, to have all of her mother's determination, and rather more of it than could sometimes be managed comfortably in a single household. They named her Clara, for Mrs. Hennessy, who had given Adelaide a room above a dry goods store without asking questions at a moment when questions would have been damaging, and who had died the previous winter and left the world a smaller place for her absence. Clara Ashford, born with dark hair and a very decided expression, who would grow into a woman of very decided opinions, who at 4 years old told Albert that she intended to have a horse of her own, and had selected which one, and who at 6 years old told Adelaide that she wanted to understand medicine, and would Adelaide please explain everything. Josephine, who had remained at the ranch through these years with the settled contentment of someone who had found the life that suited them, found a companionship of her own in 1889, which pleased Adelaide enormously. A man named David Macready came to Caldwell to take over the management of the feed store, a quiet, bookish man of 35 who seemed at first entirely mismatched for the frontier, but proved to possess a dry humor and a genuine love of the land that made him fit in gradually, and then thoroughly. He and Josephine began a courtship that was conducted with such careful understatement on both their parts that Adelaide and Albert watched it for a full 6 months before it was definitively confirmed. And when Josephine told them she and David were to be married, Adelaide hugged her with a warmth that Josephine returned with equal force. Josephine and David married in the same church with the cracked bell in the spring of 1890. And David moved into the ranch house in an arrangement that was, practically speaking, the most sensible option given the size of the house and the labor required to run it, and the household expanded comfortably, as households built on genuine affection tend to do. The autumn of 1890 brought a letter from Charles, Adelaide's eldest brother, the first direct contact from him since she had left Boston. It had come to her mother first, apparently, and her mother had forwarded it with a covering note that contained the single sentence, "He wishes to apologize. Whether to receive it is entirely your decision." Adelaide read it at the kitchen table while Thomas did his schoolwork at the far end, and Clara, at nearly 1 year old, was asleep in the next room, and Albert sat beside her in the way he sat beside her when she was reading something difficult, present and quiet, and without instruction. The letter was not a simple letter. Charles was not a simple man, and apologies did not come easily to people who had spent their lives accustomed to the authority that went with being the oldest son in a household where that had been a significant status. But the letter was, underneath its awkwardness, genuine. He said he had been wrong. He said he had treated his sister as an asset rather than a person and had known, somewhere that he had refused to look at clearly, that it was wrong at the time. He said he did not expect forgiveness and was not writing to request it. He was writing because he had a daughter now, 3 years old, and he found that the question of what kind of world he wanted her to live in had altered his understanding of certain things he had done. Adelaide read it twice and then set it down and looked at the kitchen window and the October sky beyond it. "Well," Albert said after a moment. "He has a daughter," she said. "Yes. I know what that does," she said slowly, "to a person's understanding of things." Albert said nothing, which was the correct response. "I am not going to pretend it was a small thing," she said. "What he did, it was not." "No," Albert agreed. "But I am not going to carry it indefinitely either," she said. "I do not think that serves me. I do not think it serves anyone." She wrote back to Charles. Not an immediate reconciliation, not a restoration of everything to what it had been, because that was not available and perhaps not desirable. But a beginning, carefully made, the first careful step onto ice of uncertain thickness, which was a way of proceeding she had some experience with. The correspondence continued over the following months, and over the following years it became something that had its complications and its distances, but that was real. The communication between two people who had hurt each other through choices made at a time of difficulty, and who were choosing, slowly and imperfectly, to be family again. Adelaide was not required to forget. She was not required to minimize. She was required to do nothing except choose what kind of life she wanted to live and what she wanted to carry forward in it. And she chose, with the same self-sufficient clarity she brought to everything, to set down as much of the weight as she could manage and go forward lighter. The ranch in the years of the early 1890s was a prosperous and busy place. The cattle herd had grown, carefully and without overextension, and Albert had made the kind of reputation in the county for fair dealing and sound judgment that meant he was frequently consulted on matters that went beyond his own immediate interests. He had formalized the informal legal assistance he gave to smaller ranchers and farming families, working with a lawyer in Wichita who came out on a circuit, and the combination of his knowledge of the law and his knowledge of the land made him genuinely useful to people who had very few other resources in disputes with the larger operators. He and Roy Garrett had settled into a relationship of permanent mutual assessment that neither of them chose to escalate, and neither was entirely comfortable leaving alone, which was, Adelaide thought, the most workable outcome for two men who occupied the same geographic and commercial space and had fundamentally different approaches to what property and fair dealing meant. Garrett had lost some ground over the years to the combination of his own overreach and the community's gradual accumulation of evidence about his methods, and Albert had gained ground through the accumulation of the opposite, and the balance between them had settled at a point where Garrett's ability to cause real harm was limited. Thomas, at 8 years old, was serious and bright, and already showing the particular combination of his parents' qualities that would serve him well throughout his life. He had Adelaide's directness and Albert's patience, and a stubbornness that both of them recognized as entirely his own. He had also developed, with the inevitability of a child growing up on a working ranch in Kansas, an intimate practical knowledge of horses, cattle, and land that was already exceeding his formal education in the usefulness it provided him. Clara, at nearly 2, was a phenomenon. She had opinions about everything and the confidence to express all of them, which Albert met with an equanimity that Adelaide admired, and that Clara appeared to find entirely reasonable, as though she had always expected to be taken seriously, and was simply confirming her prior assessment. There was an evening in October of 1891, when the harvest was in, and the winter preparations were well along, and the house was lit and warm and full of the good smell of Josephine's cooking, and the sound of David reading to Thomas at the table, and Clara investigating a wooden horse with the dedicated attention of a scientist. And Adelaide sat in the chair by the fire with the medical journal she had been reading, and Albert sat beside her with the ranch accounts he was reviewing. And they were not talking, simply present in the same space with the ease of people who had been a long and central part of each other's lives for enough years that the silence between them was one of the most comfortable places either of them knew. He looked up from the accounts at some point and caught her eye over the journal, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them that had no name except the cumulative weight of everything they were together, the agreement and the disagreement, the grief and the joy, the construction of this life out of two lives that had come separately to this wide country and found each other without looking. She had come west to disappear, and she had not disappeared at all. She had appeared, more fully than she had in any previous life, in a place and a time and a self that she would not have chosen if she had been choosing carefully, because careful choosing did not produce the life you needed. It produced the life you could presently imagine, which was a smaller thing entirely. He had found her, in the way that finding sometimes works, not by searching but by being present in the same place with his eyes open, and she had found him by the same method, both of them arriving at the thing that mattered not by plan, but by the accumulation of Thursdays and honest conversations and apples shared on a wooden bench in October sunshine. Thomas had a question about the geography homework he was doing, and Albert set down the accounts and went to help him, and Clara brought the wooden horse to Adelaide for assessment, and Adelaide assessed it thoroughly and pronounced it an excellent horse, and Clara was satisfied and took it back for further investigation, and the lamp burned warmly, and the autumn night pressed against the windows, and somewhere in the house Josephine was singing something to herself in the kitchen. Low and without particular intention, the sound of someone entirely at home. Adelaide set down the journal and looked at the fire and felt the whole settled weight of everything that was good in her life, not the absence of difficulty, not the resolution of every old pain into perfect peace, but the solid and specific goodness of this house and this family and this work and this man, who was currently explaining the difference between the Missouri River and the Mississippi River to their son, with the patient clarity of someone who considers the accurate transmission of information to be genuinely important. This was what she had built in the place where she had come to disappear, a life so full and real, and hers that disappearing had simply become impossible. You could not disappear when you were this present. You could not vanish when this many people required you, were glad of you, looked for you in the room. She had come west to disappear, and he had found her anyway, and neither of them had been looking for the other, and it had mattered, it had been everything. It had been the thing that changed all the other things. Albert came back to his chair, and Clara immediately climbed into his lap with the wooden horse, and he settled her against him with the practiced ease of a man who had been a father for 6 years, and considered it among the best of his several occupations. And he reached across with his free hand and took Adelaide's hand where it rested on the arm of her chair, and she turned her palm up to hold his, and Thomas went back to his geography with the quiet satisfaction of his question answered. And the fire burned and the lamp burned, and the night outside was full of stars. In the years that followed, Adelaide and Albert Ashford of Caldwell, Kansas, grew old in the way that people grow old who have built something real, not slowly and reluctantly but steadily, and with the particular grace that comes from being willing to change alongside the thing you have built. The ranch grew and Thomas grew into it, and Clara grew into her own particular version of her parents combined, the sharpness and the steadiness together in a package that managed to be simultaneously exasperating and deeply reassuring. Josephine and David had 2 children of their own, a son named William and a daughter named Frances, who grew up alongside Thomas and Clara in the easy intimacy of cousins who are also neighbors. Adelaide's practice expanded and formalized over the years, and she trained 3 young women after Ruth Calloway, each of them given the same practical education she had received from Dr. Webb expanded by everything she had taught herself in the decade following, and the community of Caldwell was healthier for her presence than it would otherwise have been, which was a thing that could be measured in specific outcomes, and that Adelaide measured with the same methodical attention she brought to everything that mattered. Dr. Webb died in 1893, peacefully, in his tomato garden, with the novel he had been reading beside his chair, and a look on his face that everyone who knew him agreed was entirely consistent with his general approach to things. Adelaide sat with him the last weeks and was glad to do it, and she spoke at his service with genuine feeling, because he had been kind to her when kindness had not been required, and had given her the means to build something she valued, and those were not small things. They were married 20 years in the spring of 1904, and Thomas was 19 by then, serious and capable, and already the person who would, in due time, inherit and run the ranch with the same steady competence his father had built into it over 30 years. Clara was 15 and absolutely certain of several things, including the direction of her own future, and the certainty did not always make for a smooth household, but it made for an interesting one, and Albert received it with a patient affection that made Adelaide occasionally wonder whether he was in fact a saint, and then remember that he was not, that he had faults and limitations and stubborn moments of his own, and find this much more reassuring than sainthood would have been. Because what they had was built between 2 real people, and was therefore more durable than anything constructed out of idealization. They sat on the porch on the evening of their anniversary, the 2 of them alone because Thomas had taken the wagon to town, and Clara was at Josephine's with her cousins, and David and Josephine had wisely and kindly arranged the whole of it, so that this one evening was unoccupied, and the spring was in full bloom around them, the prairie grasses thick and green, and the wildflowers making their annual statement about the generosity of the world. And the sky was doing the thing that the Kansas sky did in the long spring evenings, burning through its full range of colors from gold to orange, to a deep rose to the first clear blue of approaching dark, and the stars were beginning. 20 years, Adelaide said. 20 years, Albert said. They were quiet for a moment, the full kind. Do you regret coming west? He asked, which was a question he had never asked in exactly that form, and she understood that he was asking it now because the anniversary made certain things available that ordinary evenings did not. She looked at the burning sky and thought about the woman who had stepped off a train at Caldwell, Kansas, in September of 1883, with a burned letter in her history and a heart determined to be closed, and she thought about everything that had happened since, the fear and the courage and the work and the love and the children and the grief and the joy, and every single Thursday afternoon from the first one until now. Not for a moment, she said. Not once. Not 1 minute of one day. He took her hand. The same unhurried motion, the same quality of presence, 20 years of practice and still entirely itself, nothing reduced by familiarity, everything deepened by it. I was afraid, you know, he said. For a long time after Alina, I thought I did not have anything left that was worth giving to someone. I had the ranch and the work and Josephine, and I told myself it was sufficient. And then, she said, and then a woman with a steady hand and no patience for fuss stitched up my arm and told me the carbolic would sting before she applied it, he said, and I went home and could not stop thinking about her. She laughed, and he turned to look at her with the smile she had been collecting for 20 years, the uncontained one, the real one, and she was 24 years old again on a Thursday afternoon eating an apple on a wooden bench in the October sunshine, and she was 44 years old on her porch on a May evening with the prairie blazing around her, and she was all the ages in between, every one of them, and she was here, entirely and completely here. in the life she had built in the place where she had come to disappear. "Albert," she said. "Adelaide," he said. The stars were coming out over Kansas, one by one and then all at once, filling the enormous sky from edge to edge, and the land lay quiet and wide under them, and the house behind them was warm with everything that had been built inside it. And the two of them sat together in the spring night and watched the world declare itself beautiful, and were glad, as they had been glad for 20 years, of every single ordinary and extraordinary thing.